Hello, AP Euro. I'm finishing up Scientific Revolution and doing Enlightenment right now. Okay, so this is what we got. Scientific Revolution, Enlightenment. Scientific Revolution's heyday is like in the 1600s into the 1700s, Enlightenment in the 1700s, late 1700s. Both intellectual movements that use observation and logic to make conclusions about nature for the Scientific Revolution and society for the Enlightenment. The other two important scientists, there are lots of important scientists, but because there's this methodology of using logic and reason, there are two scientists who are especially important because they're the type of work they do are used by the Enlightenment philosophers, and these are the two people who are who work with reasoning and creating what we know now as the scientific method. And these two thinkers are Rene Descartes or Descartes. It's Descartes, he's a French guy. Rene Descartes and Robert Bacon. And they have deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And take a look at Crash Course to get an explanation of it. Descartes' deductive reasoning, he's famous for the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." They find true statements in deductive reasoning and then make logical conclusions based from that truth. Robert Bacon in inductive reasoning, this is as close as we have to the scientific method, inductive reasoning, making a hypothesis, proving it with evidence, and then making conclusions based on it. And so this is using the scientific method. Okay, so challenging society, Enlightenment philosophers, using logic and reason and observation. The first who is usually taught is Thomas Hobbes. And so I'm going to start off with Hobbes and also John Locke, because they both have to do with the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. And Thomas Hobbes, he's alive during the time of Charles I, and he argues against divine right. So he's against divine right, and he argues for something called a social contract. Social contract is what this is, social contract. And a lot of these philosophers argue about social contracts, whether it's Thomas Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau later. In this social contract that Hobbes argues for, he actually supports absolutism. He says that people need a strong ruler in order to keep the peace. But what he doesn't use, he's using logic and reason. He's going against divine right. He's not making an argument that the ruler has the right to rule from God or a blessing from God. Instead, he's using logic and reason rather than religion or superstition. And so that's why Hobbes, even though he's arguing for absolutism, he's using the idea of a social contract rather than divine right, which makes him an Enlightenment philosopher. He's alive during the times of Charles I, and he was horrified by what he saw when Charles I was killed. And so he said that we do need a strong king, and he thought that a strong monarch was the way to go. John Locke, on the other hand, was alive during the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So these guys were a generation apart. I know 1649 because that's when Charles I's head came off, and so I know that's when Hobbes was alive. John Locke, I know he was alive during the time of the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So I know that that's around the time when he was alive. And he argued for many things. The thing that we remember is life, liberty, and property. Meaning that, and he argues mostly that people have a right to life and liberty and property, and the government cannot take this away without due cause. Of course, during this time, he's not arguing that all people deserve life, liberty, and property. He's really saying that men and white men who are wealthy, who have property, deserve rights to life and liberty. Remember that some of the contradictions of this time was that there is slavery. England is the biggest shipper of slaves and has slaves in their colonies at this point. And so he's not making the argument that all people deserve it. However, later, the words of Locke are going to be in our Declaration of Independence, and later we're going to use his words to argue for freedom that apply to all people, including women, including people of color. But at least at this time, he's making an argument for constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy, putting limits on a ruler. And so this challenges the idea of absolutism and the king being able to be able to take property or liberty or freedom or the life of someone without due cause. Okay? And so these are the first two Enlightenment thinkers I think of. Then there are these others who we did posters of and who I think of. There are the philosophes, who are the French ones. And those philosophes include Voltaire, as well as Montesquieu, and also Rousseau. These are the big guys. And also one other guy, Diderot. Voltaire argues for freedom of speech and religious tolerance, freedom of religion, religious tolerance. And he's a humorous guy. Candide is a humorous book, yet a biting satire at the wealthy, and it really it challenges absolutist beliefs, it challenges folk beliefs and superstition, it challenges the church, and he does this through humor and through his freedom of speech. He was locked in prison. He was in prison multiple times, and fled France and lived in England, which he admired. A lot of these people admire constitutional monarchies. They don't actually admire direct democracies. Most of them think that the people can't be left. They're not responsible enough to govern themselves. He also argues for religious tolerance. Remember, he's alive in France during the time of the Louis, when the Edict of Nantes has been revoked, and you can only be Catholic during this time. And so he speaks out against that too. He also becomes friends, as we'll see later, with several enlightened despots or monarchs during the time, such as Frederick the Great and Catherine of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, who he becomes friends with, but then offends and is kicked out of those countries too. Montesquieu, the big thing to remember here is separation of powers. And here he argues that all the power should not be in the king, but that it should be separated into three equal branches of government that check each other: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And this is Montesquieu's idea, this French philosophe. And so it's always funny to me to hear people talk about these American ideals in the Constitution, but they're all taken from the idea of French people, or from English people, or as we'll see later, an Italian, Beccaria. Rousseau has a lot of ideas. Social contract's one of them. The one I like to remember is rule of law. Rule of law. And this idea is that no one is above the law. If you remember from the Magna Carta in the classroom, that the teacher can't just do whatever he or she wants, that they're also accountable to the law. And that's an idea that challenges absolutism. Rousseau, you can look into your book, he challenges a lot of norms and culture, even the idea of marriage and only having one partner. He is one of the few people who argues for direct democracy. However, he's not a feminist. He's not in favor of women's rights, of which Mary Wollstonecraft, who we'll write down later, is arguing for at the time. Diderot, his big contribution is the encyclopedia, or the encyclopedia, where he's taking information and collecting it. And it's not, it was actually banned, and any way to make a book popular is to ban it. And it's a huge encyclopedia, and this challenges the idea of the church and of absolutist beliefs. And Diderot is one of a prolific author, and came up with the encyclopedia. And he was also friends with Catherine the Great and went and visited her too. Okay, the other two philosophers are Beccaria, Cesare Beccaria, who's Italian, and he writes in favor of a fair criminal justice system and the abolition of torture, of police who are or a public justice, and a lot of his a fast and speedy trial, and lots of his writings, which was called On Crimes and Punishments, are in our Constitution. And the final philosopher, so even though this is a time, Wollstonecraft, even though this is a time dominated by men, a patriarchy, you still have, as we had during the scientific revolution with Maria Sibylla Maryland and Margaret Cavendish, or during the, think about the Renaissance with brilliant artists like Sofonisba Anguissola, or think about the times of monarchs. Even though it's patriarchal, we have strong monarchs like Elizabeth I in England or Queen Isabella. You also have a strong woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, who's arguing for feminism. And remember, I am a proud feminist, as everyone should be. It just is the idea that women and men should be equal. It does not mean women should be superior. It is just asking for equality economically and politically and socially. And that's what Wollstonecraft argues in her book in 1791, argues for feminism. And so there you go. There are the some of the major Enlightenment thinkers, and then next to the scientific revolution thinkers. Oh, also, while the scientists get together in royal societies, if you remember from the Getty Museum, the French philosophes, they would gather in salons, or living rooms in fancy homes, and they would speak and gather and share ideas. And one of the most famous salons, MDE, which is short for Madame Mrs. Geoffrin. She had a living room in Paris where she would invite the great thinkers of the day of France, of Diderot, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire. They would find their way to Madame Geoffrin's salon where they would share their ideas. And this is going to lead into the French Revolution, these dangerous ideas for religious speech and tolerance, of separation of powers, of the rule of law, of teachings that go outside the church. This is one of the causes, the intellectual causes of the French Revolution, and also of the American Revolution in 1776. They're getting ideas about government of the people, and of course of the people. Locke's idea of white men who have property, and in favor of constitutional monarchies. Okay, there you go. There's this for now. I'll make one more video about enlightened despots.